Hello everyone, this is Smita Mishra, a tester and sustainability enthusiast, welcoming you. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining us from across the globe. While we understand life is a bit boring and mentally taxing to not be able to meet people or to do a lot of things we would have been doing otherwise in a normal pre-COVID world, and continuous focus on social distancing and sanitization may be taking its toll, we still hope you all are doing well and taking care of yourself and staying safe. With that said, welcome to our today's episode of the STP Training Webinar Series. The title of our talk today is The Hidden Costs of BDD Tools. Our guest speaker joining us on the webinar is Titus Fortner. I'm excited to host you all and Titus on the STP webinars. Before we get started with the webinar, let me quickly share an important update that may be of your interest. There is an upcoming webinar, BDD plus Gherkin minus BDD equals happiness, on the 12th of August. The speaker for this is Bas Hamera, who is the founder of Possum Labs. In this presentation, Bas will discuss organizational impacts from domain-specific language test automation. So the link is up for you to register. Please do go for it. Also, we are inviting proposals for STP webinars from all of you, and this shall be open all year round. So you can submit anytime you are ready. All the details along with the submission form are at the link given on the screen. Please do go through them. And in case you have recommendations on topics or speakers, do email them to us. We'll be happy to hear from you. And if you are on Twitter, please share the call for papers or information about this webinar with your followers and connections. You can add STP's Twitter handle to your tweets, which is @SoftwareTestPro. Please do add the hashtag STP webinar to your tweets. Also, please note down the Twitter handle of our speaker today @Titus Fortner. And also, please take note of the organization's Twitter handle too, which is @SauceLabs. Do follow them and continue the conversation beyond this webinar. All right, so let's get started with the webinar today. Welcome, Titus. We are very excited to have you with us. And let me quickly introduce you for all of us here. Titus Fortner is a senior solutions architect with SauceLabs. He's a core contributor to the Selenium project and the current project lead for Water, a Ruby test library built on top of Selenium. Titus has implemented automated tests at 5 different companies before joining SauceLabs as a solution architect, and each of these used behavior-driven development tools in one way or other. At Sauce, Titus has worked with numerous clients to provide framework assessments and identify key areas that can be improved in code to better achieve the company's goals. So now let's hear from the doer himself and get started for our session today. The hidden costs of BDD tools. Titus, the floor is all yours now, and I'm going to sit back and learn from you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here. And it sounds like the next week's topic is, or next month's topic is also going to be on behavior-driven development tools or the process. So I guess I'm happy I'm going first, but we'll see how this goes. So yeah, we kind of already did a little bit of the intro, so let me breeze through this a little bit. I did work at 5 different companies before joining SauceLabs. I did get involved with open source development while I was doing that work. Core contributor to Selenium, project lead for Water, and then I'm also on the browser tools working group for the W3C. This is the group that's creating the WebDriver specification for how Selenium works under the hood, or how Selenium communicates with the servers and the drivers to drive the browser. And I've been a senior solution architect at SauceLabs for 3.5 years now. So while I'm at SauceLabs, and the reason that bit is important is I've seen a lot of different code bases with a lot of different clients, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on, but writing good DOM to database tests is really difficult. Selenium has some challenges I'll discuss, and big picture is myself and my colleagues at SauceLabs haven't seen Cucumber make that difficult process any easier, and oftentimes see it being made more difficult. And that's just empirically the different clients that we're working with specifically at Sauce Labs. Now, for me in particular, there's 3 companies specifically that I used Cucumber and worked with behavior-driven development tooling and a little bit the process, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And the 4th one we did, I did a BDD light kind of a tool, but that's. So the other thing is, this is not my first talk on Cucumber. In 2013, I gave a talk at the Selenium conference. I didn't get my video to work for this, so you can't tell the difference between how young I look in that photo there versus now. But I got done with that talk, and I realized right away that it wasn't the talk that I wanted to give. I believed the things that I said. I was very pro Cucumber, very pro BDD, but I wished that I had tweaked it a little bit to make it something that would have had more staying power with my actual opinions on it. So what I'm trying to do here is to assess this topic comprehensively, because there's a lot of but what abouts involved in Cucumber and JBehave and all of the karate and all of the other Gherkin-based tooling. And so this is kind of a moving target, and I'm going to try and hit everything, and at a high level at least, to give my thoughts on where things are. So one of the issues is a lot of different people choose BDD tools for a lot of different reasons. And so I'm going to try and get into why some of those are there and whether it's a good idea or not, and why. My colleagues and I have gotten into a number of vocal disagreements on social media with a number of BDD tool authors and consultants. And there's the behavior-driven development community has a lot of interesting things to say about a lot of things. I think we're actually seeing a lot of the same problems to a certain extent. We're just weighting them differently and coming to slightly different conclusions on this, and also potentially applying it in different contexts. So trying to disambiguate it, we'll see how well we do with this. So one of the things that a lot of these tool authors will discuss is they're focused on behavior-driven development as a process. Whereas my focus is, how do I make people more successful with their DOM to database tests? How do I get you to write tests that effectively validate functionality from what the user is working on in the browser to the API, through the service layer, to the database, and back, is working the way that you intend for it to work. So we've got a slightly different focus, and that'll probably come out in some of this conversation. So I found it helpful to start with things I don't believe, because things get made into straw men pretty quickly here. I don't think the approach to behavior-driven development is bad. I sometimes think that we get too focused on the specific process. And this is true with Agile. This is true with anything that smart people have come up with these great ideas. And then we get so focused on the process and the tooling and the details of it, where, to be honest, there are a lot of Agile consultants out there that have made a lot of money selling specific solutions that have confused what Agile actually is, which is principles and ideas. And I find that frustrating. I also don't think that you can't be successful with BDD tools, which I guess without the double negative is, I think you can be successful with this tooling. The question I have is this your best success? Is this the right way to get to your success? Would there have been an easier way to do it? Are you making the decision to do this for the right reasons? All right, so what do I believe? I think too many people are choosing to use these tools, and they're choosing to use them for the wrong reasons. And one of the reasons that is the case is, I think, the sales pitch. There's a lot of different reasons people choose it, but there's a lot of buzz around these ideas, and a lot of energy goes into promoting this. And while I've seen a number of kind of one-off articles here and there talking about people's specific struggles, and I have lots of conversations with developers saying, I don't understand why this tool is being promoted so much because I'm not getting it to work for me. I don't like, and then when we post on social media about some of these ideas and essentially get attacked by people, you know, vehemently disagreeing, I don't think these ideas are out there in a sufficiently comprehensive way to allow people to make useful decisions. And so, yeah, I think that for the function of DOM to database testing using Selenium, using Sauce Labs in particular, I believe that BDD tools are more likely to do harm than good. And that can be said about a lot of things, but I'm specifically applying it to BDD tools right now. And partly there are better alternatives. There are better ways to do the things that you need to do to get the value you're actually trying to get from this process. So I give a number of talks on a whole bunch of different topics. The generic kind of best practices talk that I give is framed with the Valley of Success. This comes out of kind of the ops world, where when things are so rigidly structured that there are a number of single points of failure, anything that goes wrong, the comment is like, it'll throw you into a pit of failure. You fall down into the pit anytime something breaks that one right way to do it. And I think a lot of people in their test automation strategies fall prey to this. And the difference is, so someone's like, but I don't want to, instead of a pit of failure, is there a way that we can create a pit of success and have people like provide the guide rails or whatever the convention so that it's easy to succeed rather than easy to fail? And I got to thinking about this idea, and I'm like, well, this is more like a valley. We're all trying to move in a given direction. We're all trying to get somewhere, but you have a bunch of different options. You can stay in the valley where it's easy and things are straightforward and maintenance is not a concern. You've got, you know, your lush grass and river and fruit trees, or you can take the mountain path where it's hard and difficult and it snows and people fall and lots of potential problems. And so the idea, well, and I just don't like mountain climbing analogies in general, so this is kind of my rejoinder to, oh, it's like I'm climbing a mountain where it's really hard, and then you reach, and it's like, well, what happens when you reach the summit in this analogy? You're done, like you don't have to do anymore. So that's a little frustrating to me. Also, valleys are just kind of awesome. I'd like to think of this from the strategy of we should be evaluating the choices we make on a daily basis for how we are testing, and framing it with the idea of how do I make what I'm doing harder to fail in the future. So instead of focusing on how can I be successful with what I'm doing right now, you want to be thinking about the upcoming maintenance costs, because those are the most important things. That's the most expensive thing in perpetuity of the test framework and strategy you're working on. And I think if people tweak their thoughts to like, what is the more direct way to do this? What is the more simple way to do this? What is the way that future users are going to be able to be brought on board and work with this subject? That's a better way of looking at it. And probably the epitome of staying in the Valley of Success versus climbing a mountain is using a tool for a tool whose purpose is behavior-driven development facilitation when you're not actually doing that process. And so let's talk about that. So first of all, there's a great sales pitch for these tools, and they don't often discuss what the costs are. So let's walk through what it's supposed to be. So you got this idea of the three amigos. You have product or business, you have the developers, you have the testers. The idea is they're not talking enough about what's going on, and so you have Conway's Law where everything is done separately, and it's causing a lot of problems in how things are managed. The goal is you get these three people together talking about things, agreeing on what needs to be done, and then executing on what needs to be done. Then there's this idea of a single source of truth. You use this given when then syntax to not only for just automating your tests, but you're agreeing ahead of time on what the specifications for the feature are. What does it mean for this user story to be complete? What does it mean for this functionality to be correct? And you create the specifications. And then because the code is executing those specifications for regression tests, that can then become the living documentation, because if anything changes, the tests will fail, you have to update the specifications, and now you're making sure that the documentation is also up to date. And that's great. And the goal with this is for it to drive implementation. We are getting everyone together ahead of time to figure things out so that we can do this collaborative process to make the overall product better. And I'll talk a lot about imperative versus declarative tests, and just from a big picture, it's like focusing on the what versus focusing on the how. Are you giving a detailed recipe for exactly what to do, or are you describing big picture what needs to happen and differentiating that from the implementation? And the idea is for these tests to feature files to be written with more declarative statements rather than implementation detail heavy extraneous information. And then the goal here is also you can do parallel work. You decide at the beginning of the sprint what it's going to look like, and then the developers will go and implement it, and the testers will go prep the tests and get an idea of, like, you just have to fill in what the element locators are because you already know what the flow is supposed to look like, so you can get everything set up. And I mean, what often happens in a sprint, at least in my experience, is the first week and a half the developers are doing a lot of work and the testers are futzing around with who knows what, but has nothing to do with the current sprint. And then the last day or two of that 2-week sprint, the testers are working all night trying to make sure that everything's working and feeding back information to the developers, which is not ideal, and this process is supposed to address that. And then transparency, this is great. Everyone can read what's going on. There's the specifications, everyone understands exactly how things are working, and it's great for that reason. Problem is, that's not how it actually works in the real world for the vast majority of companies that I see. It's supposed to be a collaboration tool. I'm not sure I've ever seen anyone actually collaborating with everyone. The three amigos often is just the one amigo. The tester's like, I've heard good things about this, let's use it. There's no collaboration. Developers don't care. Business people don't care. Not always. The business people are more likely to be involved than the developers most of the time. Partly this comes down to the idea that rather than a single source of truth, you end up with 3 different sources of truth. You've got 2 translation layers. The business people end up writing the Gherkin syntax, or the testers are translating it from the test cases that they had. They're writing it into these given when then statements. And then you're using some kind of English matching, traditionally it's a regular expression, to get it into your step definite, to define which step definition is going to get executed. There's no one that's really, like, oftentimes, because we're not all coming together and talking about this, and even if you do, there's no one that's really validating that the code that you've written matches the English syntax that you have. There's no one that's often checking that the actual thing that you need to determine is what's accurately translated through the given when then into the code. I have never met a product person that wanted to just have everything in a Gherkin statement. It used to be Word docs. They'd have these huge long Word documents that had everything. There's now a whole bunch of really awesome graphical tools for mocking things out and doing all of this stuff. No product person is going to want to keep everything about what the feature is in a Gherkin syntax. And so that's always going to be rework for the product person. I have very rarely seen feature files drive development. It's almost always, let's catch up with what the developers have already done with the existing feature files. Almost always it's, let's redo what we have right now is not working, so let's redo it in Cucumber. Let's redo it in JBehave. Let's redo this. And then it's all playing catch up with this overhead rather than something that's actually driving development. And when you don't have your developers participate, you can no longer get that parallel work. You do end up back in that idea of you're waiting for your developers to actually show you what they're doing so you can test it. And the developers like to wait till the very last minute to be able to finish things. there's a lot that people will say about, oh, but we want things that everyone can read. My boss can read it, the managers can read it, the VPs can read it, the product can read it. Everyone can look at it and see what's going on. And I have, like, maybe the first time you do it, and like, oh yeah, that looks really great, you know, good job. And then they'll never look at it again. So who should use BDD tools? I said that they're not always bad, even though I'm describing that a lot of real world issues. If you're practicing behavior-driven development process, BDD tools are appropriate. I just don't often see that. I often make a joke that Cucumber is for consultants, and I'm not trying to be dismissive with that statement. It's funny, but it's not necessarily dismissive, because I think there's a lot of value in the vice president says, we are not doing Agile well, we're not communicating well. Let's bring in an Agile consultant to come and revamp our process so that we can realign with a more effective way of doing things. And from that standpoint, I think it's a great tool to, you know, the VP has said, you guys all have to do this. And so everyone has to come to the table, everyone has to work on it. Now, is that the long-term solution after the consultant leaves? Not always, because I've seen those things go very bad very quickly after the consultant leaves. And a lot of it has to do with culture. Like, I have seen a lot of issues, like just working with clients, you know, while I'm at Sauce Labs, and I probably should have explained for anyone who is not familiar with Sauce Labs, we're essentially an online grid for Selenium, and so we provide browsers and operating systems for users to run their Selenium, Appium, DOM to database tests on our platform. And my role at Sauce Labs is to help people write the code that makes them more effective at doing that. One of the things we see, I went to an on-site with a client a year and a half ago or so, and was giving a talk, and we were expecting 75 people in the room, and there were only about 25 that showed up. And we're like, what's going on? And they're like, oh, well, we're making this transformation in the organization so that all of the testers are now also developers. And so they're working really hard on learning to be developers. Normally they would have come to this talk, but now they're trying to be developers. I'm like, well, why aren't they still here? Why aren't the developers here as well? And it's like, oh, well, the developers don't care. And so there's a certain amount of culture and buy-in that needs to happen that doesn't always happen. And one of my concerns with the way Cucumber or BDD tools are often framed is, instead of do the process, here are some tools that will aid you, it's often, here are the tools, they will facilitate this process. And so like the emphasis is different in a less useful way. Another thing I hear a lot is, hey, let's do Cucumber, and once we have it in place, then we can develop this process. And that also doesn't work very well, because you also need to be developing a process that people actually want to use. And very rarely will you start with a tooling and then say, now we all have to change what we're doing for this process. I don't think I've ever seen it go that direction. Mostly because developers don't care, mostly because just the culture at the company isn't where it needs to be to have that communication. And this is kind of where I get back to the idea of, don't be such a stickler to a specific process that you're not able to actually accomplish the underlying goal. I would much rather you talk to your testers, talk to your developers, and the business people get looped in regularly in. I would much rather that happen informally than not at all, or to happen informally rather than trying to force a specific process that no one actually likes. So that's kind of what the people writing the blog posts about Cucumber and the tool authors, that's kind of what they say. But there are a lot of people that still say they want to use a BDD tool even when they're not practicing it. And this is one of the frustrations I have with a number of prominent advocates of these tools, developers of these tools. I wish we could all agree that if you're not doing the process, you shouldn't use the tool. But oftentimes I hear, no, we want them to use the tool anyway, and hopefully that will bring them about to the process. And it's just a very frustrating mindset to me. I'm trying to be generous here. It feels a little self-serving at times. I don't think it needs to be, and I don't think it's intended to be, but the people saying it do have a vested interest in that being what happens. And then partly most of what I'm seeing is people using this for Selenium, for driving a browser, for this full DOM to database evaluation of their features. And even Aslak will say there's a lot of overhead that comes with that, and it might not be the best tool. So here's where I'm going to get into the specifics of my frustration with BDD tools. I feel like people say, this is who we're targeting, this is our target audience, this is who should be using the tools. But what is actually happening is they've developed a tool that is very appealing to a large subset of people. In fact, I would argue the most heavy users of these tools are these people that should not be using it. And these are manual testers that are looking to do automation. They're like, oh, I don't really know how to do code very well. You've got these manual testers being told, hey, you need to learn to write code or else your job is going away. Like, writing English is easier than writing code. And so they're going to be like, oh, this is a great tool. I can focus on writing the English parts rather than the coding parts. And like, oh, look, I can practically copy paste these test cases, these thousands of test cases we've developed over the last 5-10 years. We can just copy those into the feature file, and then someone can implement those things. Probably not me. And to a certain extent, if you are working at a company that has a lot of manual testers that you don't want to let go because they have a lot of context knowledge, there is something to be said for, well, let's give them something to do so that we can keep them around, even though what they're doing is not the most useful thing for the technical results of validating functionality of a web application using an automated test. One of the reasons that people are drawn to BDD tools is the frustrations around what Selenium is and isn't. And this is a whole hour conversation in and of itself. And it's a very topical one because there are a lot of negative things being said about Selenium right now, usually by tools and marketing teams at smaller companies that are trying to differentiate themselves. And partly they're comparing Selenium to more fully featured tools. Selenium is designed to be a browser automation implementation. It's a library that converts your code in the various different supported languages into JSON blobs sent to endpoints to drive a browser. It doesn't help. There are a lot of testing specific features that Selenium does not help with directly. The idea has always been, let's write the base underlying library, and then we'll have the developers who are writing the automated tests write the extra logic and the synchronization that needs to happen and the abstractions that need to happen in order to be effective with writing their tests. And let me tell you, after a few years of working at SOS and looking at dozens and dozens and dozens of these implementations with our users and teams from companies that work with us, writing that additional code is really difficult. And I think a lot of people look at these BDD tools and see a structure and see something that's providing additional guidance, and they're drawn to that extra layer as something that this is something I can wrap my head around. It's something that I can start working with. It doesn't actually solve any of those synchronization issues, or I would argue the real abstraction and encapsulation requirements, but it's something that is easier to wrap your head around than just jumping into writing the code directly for a lot of people. And so this idea of the manual testers being gently brought over to automated test developers is a great idea. I think there is value in that. but it's not necessarily a technical value, and it's not necessarily a good return on investment value. Because what I end up seeing is just a lot of people doing busy work, rewriting things instead of writing code. So reusable steps is another thing a lot of people get excited about. Someone that provided a question or a comment before this talk has probably listened to me right now, said that the successful implementations that they've seen were when teams started from the beginning with a very specific keyword library and then stuck to it rather than implementing their own. And that approach is like, just makes me shudder. And I'll talk about why. People like, you can build up the step definition library, so like anyone can write the test. Your boss can write tests. The problem with this idea of reusable steps is that if you are writing declarative business function in your feature files, it is impossible to write a new test without writing a new step definition. And I'll get to that more in a second. But essentially what these teams end up doing is they're creating a keyword-driven testing solution. They are requiring, when I click on a field that has the CSS value, when I enter John Doe into the name field at this CSS selector. And it gets very detailed and implementation specific in the feature file. And that feature file becomes dozens of lines long, which is essentially forcing imperative testing. And I would argue that imperative testing is inherently less maintainable. Can you use it? Can you make it work? Yes. In the long run, it's going to cause a lot more problems than if you have a better abstracted. Another client that I worked with recently doing Cucumber specifically. So I love page objects. I've given talks on page objects. I think a lot of people misunderstand page objects and got a lot of ideas on how to make page objects better. I'm talking to someone, he's like, I got rid of my page objects. I'm like, why would you do that? And he's like, well, I realized because of the way that we've got our Cucumber set up, all I was using them for was to store locators. And those are constants. And so I just switched everything into a property file so I could look up the name value to get the locator value. And I'm like, that's entirely reasonable. I think if you're doing a declarative approach, you're not abstracting out implementation of services for a given page. You're just accessing elements. And that's one of the things people are like, oh, I've got this page object. All it's doing is returning element locators. You know, like page objects are bad. I'm like, no, that's not the intention behind page objects if you're writing declarative tests. Also, your boss is never going to write a test, so you can just forget about that pretty much from the start. Another issue here that I take is there are somewhat competing ideologies involved. So there's this concept of the law of the instrument, or the golden hammer, and I find this a lot with like very smart people that have just always done Cucumber. Like that's just, they've always done it. And so every time they are given a new situation, it's like, Cucumber is going to apply here. They've got a hammer. Everything they see is going to be the nail that hammer is going to hit. And that's fine to an extent. The issue is for the people that don't have the context for that. And this is where the idea of the bus factor comes in. If you aren't familiar with what a bus factor is, it's the kind of morbid approach of how many people would need to be on your team would need to be hit by a bus before the product wouldn't work, before you couldn't figure out what's going on. And I have regularly seen teams implement complicated strategies, including Cucumber or not Cucumber or other BDD tools or keyword-driven tools, where as soon as the person leaves, none of the implementation makes sense to the successor. And so they just scrap the whole thing and rewrite it in JavaScript. And they rewrite in JavaScript just because that's what people do these days, not because that's necessarily a good idea. But I see that very frequently at this point. So something to keep in mind, that there are a lot of people that push for Cucumber and say, I have no problems with Cucumber. It's like, yes, you've been doing this for 15 years. It's second nature. And it's still not necessarily the best tool to start with. It's just the one you're used to. And so keep that in mind as far as why the choice is being made to do something. All right, so what? So I talk about all this stuff, like people aren't following the process and people like, it's just not like, why not just do it anyway? Like why should I be telling people not to do these things? And I'm trying to avoid giving straw men as I'm talking about this, as I'm trying to avoid being attacked with straw men for some of the points that I'm making. But there are some, like the specific things I've seen, there are some specific things that are very frustrating and scary. I think anytime you have a framework, this applies to any test framework, the ways that people do this. I've seen test frameworks written in such a way that they are so structured that you literally can't, there's a lot of things you can't do with it. There was, someone wrote this test framework, like, oh, we should adopt this for this other, for, you know, this client. And I take a look and I'm like, well, wait, you've removed access to the underlying driver instance. So how do I evaluate, like, how am I going to switch to a different frame? And they're like, oh, well, we never had to do that. I'm like, well, how do I close an alert? Like, oh yeah, we never had to do that. So you've made it so strict that you're preventing so many things that it's inflexible. The next step is, well, let's try and make it more flexible and just discourage people from doing the things that we know is bad. And you know, people are really smart and resourceful, and so they'll usually find ways to screw it up anyway. But this is kind of the approach of the Valley of Success of how can you make it difficult for people to fail with what you're doing? How can you, and maybe that means using the lower common denominator approach rather than the fancy new thing that you learned that's super slick and it's all in one line. Keeping it obvious is more important than clever. The problem is when a framework actively encourages bad behavior. And it's not necessarily intentional. In fact, it's never intentional, right? Like no one wants bad behavior to happen. But sometimes things are set up in a certain way that that's just how things fall out based on the people it was given to. And I'll talk about that, I think, a little bit more here in a second. Just keep in mind that there's overhead with all of this stuff. There's extra requirements. Theoretically, you can copy paste everything in your step definition and put it into a method. And now you have the exact same test, just without two different files and regular expressions. And it's even easier because you don't have to deal with passing state between steps. It's all in one method. Regular expression is really not the best way to do things. And this is pretty much any English matching. It almost always makes things more difficult. You're going to have conflicts. You're going to have issues if you're doing things the right way. Managing this, especially if you add too many tests, this can be a significant issue. And I feel like the first company I worked at, we had a pretty decent cucumber approach, but we still had these trying to do things the right way and have enough specificity so there wasn't too much duplication. We still ran into issues where the wrong step was being triggered and it would pass and it wasn't doing what we expected. And that happened a number of times. And sometimes there were tests that were like, just didn't even run. It's like, I can't tell which one to use, so I'm not going to do anything. And I didn't realize that they weren't even being run. So this is kind of back to the idea of the manual tester and just copying over the test cases. Humans and computers are good at different things. And so giving a manual tester a tool that looks familiar in specific ways actively encourages them to do things that aren't ideal for how test automation needs to work. Many of my talks, I throw up a test pyramid, even though we've seen it over and over and over again, because I still feel that, especially for a certain segment that Cucumber and BDD tools appeal to, don't think about everything is through the lens of, this is what our former test case was, this is how we did it through the UI, we are going to automate everything through the UI. And so rather than digging a little deeper into, can we validate this functionality with a black box API test? Can we validate this functionality with a service layer integration test? Can we validate this functionality with unit tests? Some of that's going to be part of the collaborative process that's available, but rarely happens in the specific use cases of these manual testers learning to automate things. They essentially try to make the computer do what the human is good at. And also, when you have a million test cases and you just try to copy everything over, it almost always fails. Like, that's just a losing strategy from the start. These aren't backed by real numbers, but this is just kind of the idea that at a certain point you have so many tests relative to the resources that can maintain those tests that you have diminishing returns, which is fine. You still have marginal value. The problem is many of our clients and many Cucumber and BDD tool users get way further out into you don't have the availability to evaluate all of the failing tests. And essentially, you might as well not even be running automated tests, because you can have huge bugs that you don't find because you have so many failing tests, you can't evaluate all of them before you have to sign off on a release. And I would say that's almost the standard, and it's much more likely, from my experience, with BDD tool users than with non-BDD tool users. And partly that might have to do with, and I do think it has to do with the people that these tools primarily appeal to. So I would feel much more comfortable in our industry if we could at least isolate those people and actively discourage them from using these tools without starting with the process or starting with buy-in from other people. And I've been talking about imperative and declarative a lot. This is an example, a real world example of someone's code that gets very specific about all of these details. Can anyone look at this and just easily see what's going on? No, it's all of these extra details. It's really hard to know, what is this actually testing? How is this working? This is a very bad imperative example, but this is what ends up being encouraged by a lot of this tooling. Here's a slightly better imperative example using a page object approach, but it's still pulling in Selenium API specific things on specific Selenium API element objects. It's referring to them directly rather than abstracting things out to a page object or a data object like I would prefer. Entering specific values that don't have contextual meaning, clicking on specific things rather than focusing on what the business actually cares about. So here's an example that I would write for a Cucumber step that's more declarative. When I'm on a given page and I sign in with valid credentials, then I should be signed in. And all of that gets abstracted to, what does it mean to be signed in? That's an implementation detail. What does it mean for the credentials to be valid? That's something that you can abstract into a data object that's pulling out, that has hard-coded value. This is what valid is. So if a change needs to be made, you now have to click a drop-down instead of clicking a button. That gets made in the page object level rather than in every single test that involves a login. So one of the major technical issues that I have with behavior-driven development tools, and this is something that I do not see talked about much, if at all, online and in the industry, is that I believe Cucumber, the way it's set up and the people it's attracting, it actively encourages them to do imperative testing and data-driven testing and doing things that make it harder to actually understand the context of what the tests are there to do, which defeats the purpose of having an additional feature file. You might as well be putting all of that in just a one method test, and ideally you're going to be learning how to abstract that out into page objects and data objects to minimize duplication. So 2013, me giving that talk at the Selenium conference, the talk I wished I had given was that here are a bunch of things I learned from using Cucumber, and I can do them without using Cucumber. I can get all of the advantages that I found without having to use the tool. in the context in which I was using it. So some of the things that I learned using Cucumber that I encourage people to do without Cucumber is to think about things from the user's perspective first. It's kind of the outside in. What does the user need to do? Let's walk through what that is. Now let's implement. I see so many people implementing page objects before they've written out the test. And it's like, well, let's start with what the user needs to do, and then what are the names that those actions have to the end user. Now let's name the methods on the page objects with those names, rather than, you know, a generic fill form or something that doesn't provide additional contextual value. I also really like the differentiation between arrange, act, and assert. This is the given, when, then. This is the things we have to do to set a consistent state for this test every single time. This action is the focus of the test that's going to evaluate the feature, the feature that we are evaluating. And the assertion is what all are we ensuring happens when that action has been taken. By not having easy access to state between steps, I think it makes it easier to decouple page objects, for instance. So like, rather than returning a value in one step and saving it to give to the next step, just new up the additional page object in the next step. And I found that much more maintainable in the long run. And the naming consistency. What is the user actually doing with this code? So I have learned good things doing BDD or using BDD tools. I don't need those tools to get the primary value I get from them. I don't need the tools to accomplish that. When a process or a tool promotes failure, you should not promote that process or tool for the context in which the failure is occurring. And for the people who have been successful using these tools, most likely they would have been more successful not incurring that additional overhead. And this is again for the people that aren't following the process that I'm speaking to, because that's the vast majority of people that I see using these things. They could have done without it and probably done a better, more maintainable solution. And yes, just because you can make it work doesn't mean that's probably the best way to do it. All right, let me pull up the dialog box here and see if we've got any questions at this point. Anything else, anything that I didn't quite answer? There's so much to go through with this topic, and I've had hours and hours of conversations at conferences and over beers and discussions about these different things. And I have learned when I'm not giving a talk about Cucumber or BDD, just not to even bring it up, because then everything in the questions and everything that goes forward is going to be focused on that particular bit.
Thank you, Titus. It was a good talk and very insightful. I'm going to take up the questions now. I'm going to read them for you. Let's start with the first one here.
Questions on Cucumber?
No, there is one. So what is your preferred alternative to the flexibility of Cucumber's tags for running various subsets of tests? What's your preferred alternative for the functionality Cucumber's profiles provides?
Yeah, this is something that's kind of based on whatever the test runner you're using. A lot of test runners do have alternatives to that, but it really depends on the language and some of those other things. In Ruby, we have RSpec that's got great, failure retry options and tagging solutions to run subsets of your tests, which is great. I really highly recommend people run subsets of features rather than subsets of tests. So it's going to be context dependent on the tooling, and there are things out there. I think in most languages, I'm pretty sure TestNG will let you do anything you want as long as you parse enough XML. And I have not actually done that yet. Well, you can do annotations in Java and JUnit pretty easily. And JavaScript, I have no idea. I've been trying to avoid JavaScript as much as possible so far. I know there's great tooling out there in the JavaScript world, like WebDriver.io, but I've been avoiding a lot of that still. So it depends. This is the really helpful answer. It depends.
Yeah. Thanks, Titus. The next question here is, any suggestions on how to undo a BDD setup?
So I have done conversions in the past away from Cucumber and into RSpec. And the first step is always, do I actually need this test? I have definitely had experiences in the past where, well, I inherited a test suite that didn't have any assertions. And I'm just like, you've got to be kidding me. And so tests that would pass or with broken features because no one put an explicit assertion in there. So I fill out the assertion, I find a bug, I submit it on Jira, I come back the next morning and product comes back with priority 5 won't fix. So the first step is always to delete the stuff that no one actually cares about and no one's going to take an action on. The second step is, by and large, you just take each of the step files that you have, fill in the value that you are automatically parsing, and you just put that into one method. And it's great, even I put a space between my setup, my action, and my assertions to keep them separated, because I do really think it's important to differentiate between what things are set up, what action you're taking, and then what. And I didn't really even go into the anti-pattern here of having a million ands and whens and thens all mixed around, but really keeping focused on, here's the setup, here's the action I'm taking, and it's a lot of it's just a copy paste from the step file, making the tweak to the value that's getting pulled in. And then I should say that's a start. And then the next step is going to be to abstract those things into a page object or data object. And theoretically, you're doing some of those things anyway, but often because it encourages such an imperative approach, they're very underpowered and poorly structured in the real world. So again, kind of a vague answer, but I have done that successfully in the past.
Great. So Titus, I will quickly move on to, because there are questions coming in really fast, so I'm going to quickly move on to the next one. Okay. It says, I love your passion on the topic and share the view that a fool with a tool is still a fool. I have usually advocated more for teams to take an ATDD approach rather than be forced into a BDD tool if the process is not there to support the tool. Would you care to comment on this approach and recommend options, please?
Yeah, I absolutely like that. And this is kind of the outside in user-focused approach of, and if you can collaborate without the tool, even better, but thinking about what the user needs to do before implementing the test, before implementing the feature, if you can be part of the sprint planning meetings or whatever the process is to do that, it doesn't have to be codified into a specific process to get the value, to get enough of the value to make it worth doing. And yes, like focusing on some kind of acceptance test driven and just getting that value, that's the most important bit. And again, this is going to be very context dependent on the specific people on the team, the things they're willing to do. No process is good enough if no one's going to use it, right? So you have to have buy-in and you have to have people committed to doing that, or nothing you do is going to work.
All right. Thanks, Titus. The next question here is, and you can, actually it's about costs. So let me know if this is something that we don't have to discuss here. The question is, do you have some concrete numbers about proportion of the bad costs? Anything, any market numbers or data that you have?
And the answer is no. Everything that I'm talking about is just very experiential. I would love to collect some data and get some direct feedback from different teams on how much they've used it and what their experiences have been, and the percent people who consider themselves successful with it, percent pass fail rate for the average Cucumber user versus non-Cucumber user, that kind of thing. I don't have that data. So this is all just, hey, from what I've seen, when someone's used, like, this is a hard thing to do, and the people that are using these tools don't appear to be doing worse than the people who aren't using the tools for the context that I'm evaluating.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so the next question here is, have you found any good tools or frameworks that provide documentation outside relying on the clean code? The code is a readable perspective.
Man, so like my ideal tool would actually be to have conventions in code writing that will automatically generate English language description of what's happening. Because, and that's another thing I didn't get into, is there are people that use feature files to be able to allow manual testers to repeat the tests, and that's why they're doing imperative stuff. So it's harder for you to get nice abstracted maintainable tests, but the way that they have the team set up to do manual. So the direct answer to your question is no, I don't know something that allows that. I really wish that there were a better way to be code first and then provide logs or assessment at a higher level. This is the kind of thing that if I can convince my company to let me do more tooling focused work, which may or may not happen, I would love to play around trying to find something like that gives you some of the advantages that people are looking for from these tools, without having to do the things that make it difficult for those tools to be successful.
Sure. I'll quickly move on to the next question. What is your thought for data testing in capturing these requirements?
So, data testing, so like data-driven testing kind of things. So, all right, so this is where it comes into kind of the test pyramid. This is an excellent example of, as a user, and this is another thing I didn't really get into with Cucumber, is I think Cucumber also encourages journeys, like flows through a website, rather than atomic tests. And so, especially Sauce Labs, we're focused on, can you split up these long-running flows into a whole bunch of small atomic focused tests that will give you better feedback, cause fewer errors, shorter tests fail much less often than longer tests. And what I recommend for data tests, so as I would like to validate in my DOM to database test that this form is working correctly. All of the fields correctly map to the keyword value pairs in the JSON blob that's getting sent to the API before it hits the service layer. If I can make sure that what's in the UI is getting sent to the system correctly, and the system is handling it correctly, and the system returns those values correctly, I shouldn't be doing then in the code the same thing that a manual tester does, which is spending all day on a form filling out all of the different things. I would much rather take all of the combinations and permutations of data that I need to evaluate for a test and put that into a REST client, not even open a browser, and just send large packets of JSON to that endpoint directly, rather than going through a browser, because browsers are hard and browsers make things complicated and browsers are slow. You can have thousands of REST client tests hitting an endpoint and getting responses and evaluating them in the same time and with much more clarity than a handful of UI tests where you have to go element by element, piece by piece. So that's my approach to data testing, rather than trying to do everything in the UI. Leverage the computers to do things computers are good at.
Thanks, Titus. And it's like there are tons of comments and tons of questions still flowing in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you one last question here on the call, because we are already running over, just about to run over the webinar time. But we're going to share all the comments and the questions and the Asker details, so that if you would like to either put that in a blog and publish, or you would like to directly contact the Asker and respond, either way, it's fine.
Well, I mean, ideally, I'd like to do that on Twitter, if possible, to try and engage the conversation, because there are more people I'd like to get opinions on for some of these things, if possible. I'm actually not seeing any of the questions on my dashboard here like I was expecting. So, yeah, absolutely. Yes. If you've got additional questions for me, please, I would love to answer them on Twitter and engage more with this conversation. I've kind of been staying out of some of the Twitter backs and forth on some of these things, and maybe we can consolidate some of this stuff into blog posts. I know my colleague Nikolai has been doing a lot more. He's a lot better at the social media things than I am, but I love giving opinions and answering questions. So feel free to reach out with those, and maybe I can go through and answer the ones that have already been submitted.
Sure. So in that case, I'm going to then just ask you the last one and be done for now, and share the details with your team.
Great.
The last question is, if someone who has never used the BDD approach, what is your suggestion for how they should best get started?
My suggestion for how to get started if you're not doing BDD is not to use BDD by and large. Like you should actively have a reason to use BDD rather than this seems like a good tool, let me use it. And so depending on your language, I would be looking for something that uses Selenium, uses the WebDriver, which is the technically superior approach to interacting with browsers. None of the other tools, alternatives out there right now are technically superior to what's being done with WebDriver right now. And then finding some kind of test library that allows you to get some of the important testing features and abstractions and usefulness. And we've got some great tools in Ruby right now, which is why I love Ruby. Ruby's kind of going away a little bit. So I would love to, I'm trying to work on doing some things in Java where there's a lot more people, but that's slow going right now. And if anyone wants to help with coding some fun test libraries in Java, reach out to me on that as well. I'd love to collaborate with people.
Thanks a lot, Titus. I hope everybody has noted down his Twitter handle and his email ID. And please feel free to reach out to him for any further conversation about BDD or otherwise. And we are definitely going to pick up all the comments and questions and share it with them, with the Sauce Labs team and with Titus himself. And feel free to carry forward this conversation. Well, thank you again, Titus. It was a very insightful session on the inherent underlying issues with BDD tooling. Thank you for suggesting the alternatives and your recommendations. I'm sure it helped a lot of people here, and our attendees found it very informative. Thanks, Titus.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. This has been great.
Well, everyone, this concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining in, and more importantly, thank you for being so engaging and making the most of the webinar for yourself and the whole group. Stay tuned for more webinars at softwaretestpro.com. We have an upcoming webinar, which is BDD plus Gherkin minus BDD equals to happiness on the 12th of August. The speaker for this is Bas Hamera, who is the founder of Possum Labs. In this presentation, Bas will discuss organizational impacts from domain-specific language test automation. So if the subject interests you, please do sign up for the same at softwaretestpro.com. And before I leave, let me also remind you the call for submissions for the webinars. It's still open and it will remain open all year round. Please do send in your proposals at the given link. Thank you, everyone. Please stay healthy and safe. Practice safe social distancing, and good luck for all you do.